Here is a red ink by Colorverse, Dirty Red.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
A deeper red than I had expected, and there's a slight bit of a magenta lean that I'm really enjoying here in its dark tones. Like most reds, there isn't really any shading in all of these cases, but that does tend to be my preference when it comes to red inks. Now, only in extremes for the nib is there any kind of tone variation, and I really do like that predictable nature that I get from this ink. Boring is beautiful. It is always good to know exactly what you're going to get. Now, I wound up purchasing a bottle of this ink when I got it, and anytime I have to purchase a bottle in order to do what I'm doing, it does make me nervous because I might have a bottle to live with. I'm happy that I have a bottle of this because I do believe I'm going to enjoy this, and I'm not even going to put it on student papers. I'm going to keep this red entirely for myself. This is a real winner, and reds really aren't my thing.
The pen for today is a Conklin word gauge. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, you see that it is not dark, not at all. It is very noticeable on the page. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It's got kind of a Bordeaux look to it. I spent a bit of time looking and I'm like, it looks so familiar. But that's what I'm seeing here. It does shade, and it does a fairly decent job, I think. You see it in Baggins, you see it in Though, They, Were, so it's definitely there for shading, and I think that's looking pretty darn good. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Really, really enjoying the tone of this ink here. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It gives a very predictable, a very nice tone to look at. It's not obnoxious to use on the page, so if you did use it when grading, this is not something that's going to scream error, but draw attention to it because of that magenta lean. Looking at the medium nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the wet fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It doesn't shade, but I am going to go ahead and point out a couple spots where we do see a slight bit of tone variation. It does happen. Look at the word Hobbit, how it does start darker, get lighter in the middle, and darker on the end. So I say it doesn't really shade because it doesn't do it a ton and all over the place. It's present a little bit, so I can live with it. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium and with the soft fine. Beautiful, very slight magenta lean on this. It does not feather. It does not spread. It has no shading, but like on the medium, there are a couple spots where you do see a slight bit of some tone variation. Look at the letter H on Hill, top line. You see that the H is darker on the first part, gets a little lighter on the second part. So there's a tiny bit. Again, really manageable for how little there is. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems here.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 26 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, we get just a little bit lighter in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. I think we're getting more red than magenta slightness of it. Like, I'm going to call this red and not magenta, even though I'm going to refer to it as having just that hint because it's just the hint. But here, not. It is red. That's not feathering, not spreading. It is giving little bits of shading and looking very nice on the page. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. It is right about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. It looks amazing. Really, here where the paper's kind of absorbing some of what normally would have been there for some of the color, it's doing just yes. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the wet fine. The same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. No, it's a little lighter. Just a tad. And I know it should be right about the same, but it's just a tad bit lighter, really bringing out a bit more of a traditional looking red in a lot of the writing like you see on Queer In. So not bad, not feathering, not spreading, not shading, more like a classic red here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, just a tad bit darker than we had with the medium, right about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is not shading, so it's doing everything I want a red to do. Looks good on the page, performs very well. I just need this to hold up when we see the back. I hope we have no problems. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there's very, very minor ghosting. You could write back here. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, making this a great ink for this paper.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, we see that the tone is a bit different than we've seen on the other papers, and that's because the tone of this paper is kind of affecting it a little bit. It does still very much maintain being a red. We're not really seeing the magenta-ish little bit that it gives. It's not there, just a red. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. There are a few moments of shading. Now, there's some really standout moments that'll occur, like on the fourth line, built by, but you see it a little gentler in the first line of grown or being. So, pretty good here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a lot darker than we had with the soft fine. It is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does have a little bit of feathering. You will see on the third line, apparently. I choose that word because of the word. Settled, you'll see it. So there's tiny feathering. I don't see it as being something that would stop you from using it. It's not spreading. It's not giving any kind of shading. It is very dark and rich to where if someone were to look at this, they'd kind of wonder what your pen was. Looking at the medium nib, a tad bit, just barely. I don't know that it's going to show up on camera. It is only the slightest bit different in tone than the wet fine. It does feather a tiny bit. You see it on chance, first word. You see it on the a little bit underneath. You see it on the T of quiet to the right of the. So there is a little bit of feathering going on. Not horrible, not something that would stop me from using this. There is no spread. There is no shading. There is, honestly, I would call this pretty good performance for paper not made for fountain pens. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the medium. About the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. There is a tiny bit of feathering. You see it in the word numerous, prosperous. So it's there. It's not, again, it's not something that would stop me from using this paper, but it's something to be aware of if you are going to be especially nitpicky. Is it spreading? No, it is not. Does it have shading? No, it does not. But it is a solid performer. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there is some minor ghosting. You could probably write back here. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, which makes this a very good one for me.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get right about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. Why am I using both this and Clairfontaine when they're made by the same company? Because there's just slight differences, and it gives people a better reference point, I think. I don't know that I'll do it all the time. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does give a little bit of shading. It is not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, though it's definitely there. You see it on neatly in the 4th line and nearly in the 2nd line. I like what I'm seeing. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the dry soft fine. It's the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade. Gives a beautiful, rich, darker tone that I, again, am so happy that I have a bottle of this ink. It's going to come with me to school. It's probably going to be there so I can use it on my own notes. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the wet fine. Same tone as on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, not a surprise. We get no spread, not a surprise. We get no shading, but, and I say that as a majority, we do see a couple tiny spots that are a little bit darker. The word here, 2nd line, is darker than what's around it, so technically there is a little bit, but it's not something that's really being a standout feature here. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as the medium, same tone as on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. We shouldn't be surprised. It does not spread. Still not surprised. It's giving still no shading, but I'm going to call it just like what we saw with the medium. Are there a couple spots where you can say this letter's a little lighter than? Yes. Look at over on the 1st line. The O looks a little lighter than what's around it. But I wouldn't call it shading when you have to choose just 1 or 2 spots. Looking at the back of the page, we get no ghosting, we had no bleeding, we have no problems.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson. Here is Diamine Brandy Dazzle. Here is Pelican Garnet. Here is Rohrenklinger Morinda. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a little bit lighter, a little bit more muted tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. That doesn't surprise me when dealing with this paper. It is something that I regularly experience, but I do like using these competition notebooks. It's a competition. We're going for first. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It does give the smallest moments of shading that you can find some dark letters, but that's not what this is about. This is about using an incredibly economic paper for students, and I think this is doing a great job. I can't wait to see how this paper really does in the long run. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine, just a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Lighter because it's more muted, still not feathering, still not spreading, not shading at all. Nice dark rich red, no real hint of that slight magenta lean, which I seem to really kind of like with some of these reds. Not there. This is a dark red, and that's what it is. And that's okay. It's doing a very good job of it. Looking at the medium nib, we get right about the same tone as the wet fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not shading. It's doing really a great job this whole way. I don't know that there's much I can elaborate on after seeing the wet fine, but I could babble for a second because I really do like how this looks. These are my most common notebooks for me to use when at work at school. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium. I want to say it doesn't feather. However, look at the T on white, third line, right in the middle. And you're going to see a little bit of feathering that occurs on the T. You're going to see a little bit of feathering that occurs on the word beard right next to it. But it's not feathering all over the place, only in a couple of spots, which could have been hand oils. It could be a spot with the paper. Could be something the ink is actually doing. It's not spreading. It's not shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there is no problem with ghosting. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. We have a winner.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Monteverde Blue Black. Here is a gray ink by Diatramentis Charles Dickens Cement Gray. Here is a blue ink by Thornton Blue. Here is a black ink by Aurora Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is on the majority in the range of the color that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's largely lighter, duller, feathered spread. If it shades, I got a feeling that it's going to be bleeding. So I'm looking at the word immense and black and boots. Bilbo, it. I'm expecting this to bleed like crazy. Looking at the wet fine, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. It is darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a whole lot. It does shade a whole bunch. None of this should be any kind of a surprise since we're basically writing on a sponge. It does not shade, but it does go on the paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit lighter than we had with the wet fine. It does feather a little bit all over, really more of a woolly kind of a look. I think this looks much better than it did with the soft fine. or with the wet fine, but that could be the difference between a regular flow and a wet flowing pen that we're really seeing here. Because the feathering, it's there, not bad. Spread, yes, not bad. Seeing these both, you really see that they're practically the same line thickness, so that wet fine really did spread. It's not shading at all. Looking at the broad nib, it's the same tone that we had with the medium. It does feather about the same that the medium did, so manageable in what's there. Not horrible, not a big deal, but it is present. The spread, I don't think it's spreading very much of it. Is, I mean, I can put it right next to the Clairfontaine. There is a tiny bit of spread, but it looks more like just a broader broad, not a double broad. It doesn't shade. I'm going to say this is actually not too bad here. Looking at the page underneath, you see tons of spots where I circled where it did bleed through, touching the page underneath, absolutely corrupting that page. And when we see the back of the page, there's no question as to why. Look at all of that ghosting. But the soft fine did not come through and touch the page underneath. So soft fine for this paper, because it's dry writing, could really be the winner.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Any medium or wet pen will give a great solid tone and is really the way to go for me. It is a dark red with the slightest magenta when that's done, and it just looks so good. Now, in dry fines, you do get shading if you really want it. And the tone really does remind me of a Bordeaux as a color itself, not so much as a pure red, but Bordeaux.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.